Welcome to a short introduction to the Bible and literature, in which you're going to learn about the importance of the Bible as a text of literature and its influence on literature in general. We're going to look at some of the most famous stories from the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament and discuss how plot elements and symbols from the Bible find their way into novels, plays, and poems, and looking at some specific examples. So in almost all the books that you study or even read for pleasure, from primary to secondary school, you will find either biblical references and allusions, or else references to historical details related to Christian theology or stories. And this is true for Lord of the Flies, for The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime even, or The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, or A Raisin in the Sun, or The Great Gatsby, To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankenstein, so on and so forth. Of course, things like, Shakespeare is full of it. And even popular level books like The Lord of the Rings, Narnia, Harry Potter, and even the Sherlock Holmes story, to name a few. In fact, if you look around most forms of art, whether it's painting, music, or poetry, you'll see the Bible's influence in many of the most important works, and even in popular level art like rap and movies. Marilyn Robinson, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, said, "The Bible is the model for and subject of more art and thought than those of us who live within its influence, consciously or unconsciously, will ever know." That is a pretty big statement. If you want an example from a book, in Fahrenheit 451, this is a dystopian science fiction novel by Ray Bradbury. The hero finds himself holding a Bible in his hands, and he gets on the phone and he asks his professor how many copies of the Bible, Plato, and Shakespeare still exist in America. So what the author is doing there is mentioning the two foundations of Western literature, which is the Greco-Roman classical literary tradition in the works of Plato, for example, and the Bible. And then he's mentioning the greatest writer of the English language, who is Shakespeare, and who drew deeply from both of these wells of knowledge. So the Bible at one point was the book, as its name indicates. The word Bible means books in Greek, because it's kind of the only one that all people knew about. The first codices, which is what books were called at first, that replaced the traditional scrolls, were mainly bindings of the Gospels and other New Testament texts together. The Bible was central to literacy, the development of literacy, and the development of thinking throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and into the modern era. And so a deep knowledge of Bible influenced all writers who produced the classics in the Western canon of literature, with the obvious exception of the Greco-Romans one mentioned before. So the influence of the Bible on the development of nations of the West and even other nations in the East is foundational. It's at the fountainhead of our understanding of the world, knowledge, our values, our laws, and definitely our literacy and our storytelling. Even our languages were shaped by the Bible, hundreds of expressions and phrases coming from its text, so that in the same way that you're often quoting Shakespeare, as the famous poem goes, you're also sometimes quoting the Bible, as you can see in this list of expressions from the King James Version of the Bible. Now, what kind of influence has the Bible had on literature? The elements that you might find related to the Bible or religious thought in a text of literature might include something like, for example, quotes from the Bible, whether they are direct quotes or indirect, maybe allusions, sometimes even misquoting for particular effect, or putting it in context or out of context, repurposing it for a different idea. You'll also find theology derived from Scripture, references to or allusions to theology, such as the Trinity or the sacrificial death of someone to save someone else, or the idea of original sin. Also, there will be allusions through symbols, through names, through motifs that are common in the Bible, or common plot devices that harken back to the Bible, and that often understood in an instinctive way, like, deserts and water and bread, trees, wine, kingship, things like that. And then you'll find references to church history, so quotes or references to historical figures or historical debates or historical events. So, for example, people like St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or St. Patrick of Ireland and John Calvin, Martin Luther. All of these things will be found in many texts of literature. But as mentioned with the idea of allusions and symbols and motifs, the Bible also provides a series of narratives and characters that inspire stories, and these are what we call archetypes. So archetypes means original imprint. The idea of an archetype is that most stories follow a pattern that's repeated either through motifs such as the test of endurance or war, being lost and found, traveling, or character types like the hero, the anti-hero, the wise older person, or settings like the desert, the city, the context of home, or bad weather. As you know that, for example, the pathetic fallacy involves the weather telling us something about the state of mind of characters, and various other types of plots. Leland Ryken, who is an emeritus professor of literature from Wheaton College, said, for Western literature, the Bible is the definitive and most complete repository of archetypes. So the Bible is literally the book of archetypes, and its own stories have become an inspiration for many of the stories written subsequently in history. It's a rich, fertile soil from which creative writers draw raw material and repurpose it for their own stories. In fact, one way in which the Bible has clearly shaped Western tradition is in the way it's transformed the expectations people have of how a great story should end. We see this where there's a theologian and a literary critic, Peter Leithart, says, for Greeks and many other ancient peoples, history was essentially tragic. Things had begun well in a world of plenty of joy, but the world was bound to degenerate and decline until it sputtered and whimpered to a halt. We can skip the central bit, but he says at the end, the ancient world knew nothing of eschatology, the view that history moves towards an end that is greater than in the beginning. And so he mentions as an example King Lear, which is a Shakespeare play set in pre-Christian England. And he points to it as the greatest of tragedies. He says it's more tragic than any Greek tragedy that has been written, because the possibility of a happy ending, of a beautiful, wonderful ending, was set in people's minds. Because of the Christian belief in resurrection, death can lead to new life and sacrifice as well, and it can lead to happiness. And so the happy ending that gives hope comes from really the Bible's view of the end of time, which is what the meaning of eschatology is, where people will be resurrected and live in a world free from evil. And so we see this. The Greek literature has this idea of a repetitive decline, while the Bible has a view of a decline that ends with renewal. The Greeks had this idea of glorious death as the only best way to, let's say, to end a story. While in biblical texts, you have the idea, biblical, let's say, stories, you would have the idea of death and resurrection. So he sets the idea of tragedy versus the idea of comedy, not as in haha comedy, but the comedy which is a happy ending. And the idea, therefore, that everything was better and now it's bad and it's going to go to worse is countered by the idea that all will be well in the end. And this influence from the Bible is not only true for old books. Ryken says, as the 20th century unfolded, Western civilization became increasingly secularized. And correspondingly, the Bible became less dominant as the central cultural force in England and America. We might expect that the Bible became less prominent in Western literature than it had previously been, but this expectation turns out to be incorrect. The Bible remains the most frequently referenced book in modern literature, and in terms of sheer quantity, there may be as much biblically rooted literature in the modern era as in previous ones. This is really significant. And Thomas Foster, who's a professor of literature, who wrote this book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor, writes in his chapter on the Bible, this great quote. He says, Peter Frampton says that the E major is the great rock chord. All you have to do to set off pandemonium in a concert is to stand on stage alone and strike a big, fat, full E major. Everybody in the arena knows what the chord promises. That sensation happens in reading too. When I feel that resonance, that fat chord that feels heavy yet sparkles with promise or portent, it almost always means the phrase or whatever is borrowed from somewhere else and promises special significance. More often than not, particularly if the borrowing feels different in tone and weight from the rest of the prose, that somewhere is the Bible. Then it's a matter of figuring out where and what it means. So with this in mind, in the following videos, we'll look at some of the most famous stories of the Bible. We'll do an overview of its history and some of the archetypes. We'll look at some of the archetypes that are repeated elsewhere in literature or cinema. Basically, we're going to be doing a massive but very rapid overview of this subject. Thank you very much.